Good morning. My name is Vera Ingrid Grant. I am interviewing Cullen Washington Jr. today, this morning, as we revisit his incredible exhibition at the University of Michigan Museum of Art, the Public Square. Good morning, Cullen.
Good morning. How are you this morning?
Cullen, I'm fine. I'm so glad to talk with you this morning. The exhibition, the Public Square, was a highlight of my time at UMMA, and such a wonderful time to work with you specifically. And we just came to an end of that celebration of the exhibition and some talks and programming at the end of January before the world experienced these two new crises, the coronavirus and then the social unrest and protest around the death of George Floyd. So, Cullen, let me ask you just get started. How are you? How have you been during these last few months? Where are you? Have you been in your studio? Please tell us how you've been.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, when all this kind of started, it was a place for me to be still and silent and kind of just reverence and respect what was going on. And I didn't feel like it was a time for me to make work initially, talking like maybe 2 months ago. It was a time to really reach out to people, and not by text, but through phone call, which is the closest thing to touch that could possibly be communicated. And just to see how people are doing, and to try to provide some sort of communication that could take the place of, the physical. And so, it was kind of rough. I started to ponder suffering more so, and kind of looking at this thing as two pandemics, pan meaning all, and dem meaning people. So it's all people, right? And looking at both the crisis with the heightened violence and also the virus, and how those two things are connected, but looking at this thing in terms of global suffering and almost mourning about this, right? And so I did start a piece, and the piece is it's very moody. It has a lot of emotion in it, and it's kind of this catharsis for me to metabolize and understand in the best way possible what's going on, and doing it in a very kind of constructive way.
Let me ask you about this emotion of suffering. I've been thinking about grief in a national way, a global way, and we've spoken of that. But you come from a tradition in your family that you said has had great influence on your art, on your work, of a Christian kind of theoretical and moral tradition of joining with community for this type of moral outlook and the processes of mourning. So how is that part of your own story, your own familiar narrative, kind of giving you more emphasis on this idea, or is it just permeating everything in a way that's just so incremental that you're not conscious of it any longer?
Yeah, I mean, both my parents were educators, but my dad was also a chaplain. And also, for those of you who don't know what a chaplain is, one of his duties was to comfort people and counsel people during the time of death. So he was around death pretty much 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. He was also a pastor. So he's dealing with people's sense of well-being, mental, physical, and spiritual. My mother, a tenured school teacher, is dealing with, as a school teacher, you deal with it all as well. She was one of the first school teachers to integrate the school system in Louisiana. And there were snipers waiting in the woods to kill her on her first day. And I asked her, how did you get through this? And she said, I knew I had to feed my children. And, you know, so both of those kind of molded how I deal with a sense of despair and survival. And I deal with it with a device of hope. And so for me, hope is an intention that's undergirded by desire to create a possibility. And this, you know, so for me, abstraction is the analog for hope, right?
You have this kind of central node of hope within your work, and when you speak of your work. And when you came up with this theme of the public square and as a space of assembly, you talked of two things that I would love to discuss in light of the visuals that we've been seeing these last few months, ranging from the very stark emptiness of vacant public squares. Everyone is shut down. You would see these soaring images where humans are no longer in the streets. They're not in the squares assembling. They're on Zoom, as we are now, still. And then immediately juxtaposed to that came these, three events that people talk about, those dominoes, an encounter in Central Park over race, a killing in Georgia, imbued with race, and then an actual live murder videotaped that everyone was kind of captive in their living spaces watching this unfold online. I mean, we experience trauma through these things, and I would love to hear how you've been kind of thinking about this idea of hope within these kind of responses where people are at home, captive, and then bursting onto the public square.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a painter, and so painters, well, I speak for myself as a painter, I'm looking at how does what I make confront the challenge? How does it address the challenge? Not necessary to create a solution, but just to address it. And so to make an abstract painting is liberty. I think what the people that are protesting are asking for is liberty. And so I looked up liberty. Liberty is the state of being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. I mean, we have a statue, the Statue of Liberty. And so this is what it means to be an American. And I thought to myself, to paint abstraction is liberty because it's a free mark. It's a demarginalized mark, right? It doesn't have to answer to representation. And so representation to me is race. It's white or black or immigrant or even gender. You know, it has to conform to something. And so abstraction is liberated from that. And when I think about, artists like Sam Gilliam, Jack Whitten, William T. Williams, those artists that came from the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and they were making abstraction. I mean, this blows my mind. And so, Sam Gilliam caught flack from both sides. Black artists wanted him to make paintings that represented a positive image of African Americans, and then he was black, so then the white establishment might not have accepted him for making abstraction, thinking that it wasn't something that he was supposed to do. And he did it anyway, which could be seen as the highest level of protest or the highest level of radical act or behavior, in spite of all views. And so I see making a painting in my studio as an apolitical act, but when seen in the public becomes a very political act.
Yeah, I love those kind of expressions of the act of painting, you know, your personal engagement of being free to do your work. And two things that you've mentioned along the idea of how abstraction has kind of framed your art production. One is that you spoke of, in order you spoke of the condition in order to actually make work that is of an abstract nature, you need to have basic sustenance. You need to be fed, to breathe air. You know, breathing is a big part of this kind of moment right now, the ability to breathe. But to be nurtured, to have a home, to be able to feed yourself. There are food lines, you know, miles long over parts of the United States. So this is a moment of economic crisis also, parts of it that we may not have seen the full extent of yet. It seems looming. So you talk about that need in order to have this act of making, but you also, in terms of abstraction, Cullen, you speak of your work as flattening hierarchies, of flattening our perception of how our social contracts are being lived out. Please give us some more on these wonderful concepts in your work.
Thank you. So two parts. The first part I think you were addressing is about painting kind of addressing the human condition. And so for me, if clothes, shelter, and food aren't taken care of, if you're at the level of survival, if you're having to fight against the criminalization of your image, then your first reaction is to address those needs. If those needs are taken care of, then you can start to maybe think beyond the kind of necessities of life and start to kind of self-actualize. And so that's when I think that abstraction can come into play. Abstraction, the root of it was in Africa, right? When they were abstracting from the inner eye sculptures that merged God, nature, and man, one man together, as opposed to the seeing eye, which is the reality in which we see. So they were living in this kind of transcendence for, you know, beyond their sense of the necessities. Once those were accommodated, then they can start to kind of address these kind of more existential more esoteric ways of seeing reality. And so I think in the land of capitalism, those things also need to be addressed. And then after that, now you can start to make abstraction, which I think addresses the being part of the human being, right? The being part is the thinking, feeling part. And so I think that abstraction addresses that part and has no necessity for representation, which is the kind of the physicality of what we see. The second part to that is that, you know, I entitled my work after the agora, and the agora in ancient Greece was the meeting place. And what I mean by meeting place, it was the place where physical challenge happened, worship, exchange of ideas, exchange of merchandise, and most importantly, democracy was started in the agora of ancient Greece. And so the root word for agora, what it really means is to speak in the assembly. And so to name my work Agora is that these are assemblies. And the assemblies are a concert of different materials and processes. So I'm using printmaking, using drawing, I'm using painting, and all of these things kind of synthesized together in a flattened way, right? So I'm using those processes to kind of flatten what I perceive as the hierarchies in society, right? And so what I think of these ideas of ers, like prettier, smarter, better, richer, poorer, this kind of I'm besting you, or I'm bettering you, that some sort of way through privilege I'm superhuman, so to speak. And so in the paintings, I'm flattening those hierarchies and saying that we're all common. And the commonality to me is the greatest common denominator, which is thinking and feeling.
Well, I love the way that you express this kind of order of things in a hierarchical way, how people perceive them, but you gather these different art productions together in your work. That is a kind of equalizer in some way. And so that's beautiful. But at the same time, and we noted this in the exhibition, or on the exhibition walls, where we tried to let your canvases soar in that Taubman gallery, creating kind of resonances of this square to be filled with voices. At the same time, we acknowledge that Greek concept of the act of assembly excluded slaves and it excluded women. So there is a kind of, when you speak of hope, this idea of that there may be some progression, there may be some intervention, accommodation to make that concept broader, more universal, which I think also resonates with what's happening today. Can you talk a little bit about gender in your work, and as you may see that as an energy within these crises?
Yeah, I still center myself with the idea of abstraction, which is it's the civil right. And so I think about the 14th Amendment, the 13th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. And so it kind of bypasses gender. Abstraction is inclusive as well as exclusive, right? So when I say exclusive, I mean some people can't enter into the work because of the vocabulary of non-representation. Maybe the prices are too high. But the content of the work is inclusive. Abstract means, the root word of abstraction, abstract means to peel away or to take away. So I envision abstraction as taking away the conditions, taking away gender, taking away race, right? And so we get into the more expansive view, which is the human being, which is humanity. I think that the public square, or the agora, is both concrete and conceptual, which means that it can expand and evolve and kind of have different senses of place and space. Let's just say that the physical space of the public square may be closed, but now it's happening in the streets. So now it's not a static space, but rather one more of mobility.
And let me ask you about museums, which are, having their own kind of responsiveness and challenges as people talk about the art world and museums and artists in this moment. Can you share with us how you've experienced this? You spoke at first about being almost silent and in meditation maybe with the moment, but who are you connecting with now? Who are you having conversations with or reaching out? Can you talk about what your connections are right now?
It's pretty much family and friends, and because now it's about love. And so it's about the people that you love, which I think take precedent over kind of the business networking. What I have actually also thought about is how has history dealt with art and trauma. And so we see that art and trauma are like, brother and sister throughout the ages. How art movements have been started post-war. Many of our significant art movements have been started post-war. The Gutai movement, Arte Povera, Abstract Expressionism, Dada. So, but more recently I was looking at the WPA, the Works Projects, and how the government took a percentage of federal money and said, hey, we're going to pay artists to do murals. Why? Why in heaven, on God's green earth, would you want to paint murals when people need the basics, right? I mean,
right. Speaking to your earlier points.
Speaking to my earlier points, and so murals were painted. Art centers were developed for the first time in certain communities, specifically in Harlem. People who were less fortunate had a chance to go to plays and theater. And so what's the point of that? The point of that is that we're more than just consumers. When I say we, I mean Americans. We're more than just consumers. We're more than just spenders, that there's a being part of us that also needs to be nurtured. In my calling to people, what I found that the chief thing that was a concern was anxiety and loneliness. So you have another problem. It's not just the physical of the virus that you're going to get sick from, but it's also the sickness of being in solitude if that's not what you're accustomed to. And so, of course, there was a different problem during the Depression because it wasn't a virus. Of course, it was a financial thing. So people were able to congregate. But I think that the point I'm trying to make is that, art plays a vital role in our sanity and in our state of well-being. In fact, in my own apartment building, there are art nights where you can go on Zoom and people are painting. They gave out canvases, paintbrushes. I was just blown away.
I would love for you to talk more about the power of the image and how that affects your work. You've talked about how your own work and the response to it has inspired new readings for you. There have been different theoretical paths that you've taken as you've explored this idea of the agora. You mentioned Hilberg's work on the power of the image, and that seems a bit kind of opposed. When he speaks of the power of the image, a lot of it has to do with the power of the image of the human body.
Right.
And you are working in abstraction, which does not have a literal representation of the human body. Talk a little bit about how you see that in your work or your understanding.
Yeah, so abstraction for me is not only a way of making a painting, but it's also a way of thinking. And so when I was looking at Raoul Hilberg's book on the destruction of the European Jews and how he kind of outlines the 4 stages, the very first stage is kind of the dehumanization of the image of the group that you want to kind of oppress. And, that tactic is seen all over the world. When one group wants to get rid of another group, they have to justify it, create an agenda. And so the very first step is propaganda that says that these people are not human. And so as an artist, I have agency over the image, right? I mean, and it's a powerful thing. The images that we consume on a daily basis help to inform and conform how we think and feel about ourselves as much as how we think and feel about other people. So if I have this power to create an image that can expand that, then I'm in a pretty good place. So for me, abstraction allows for the expansion of this conversation. It's for everyone to be included, right? And so this is, instead of a pandemic, maybe this is pan hope, right? This is for everyone, whether you like it or not, to be included in the conversation by no exclusion. So if someone looks at the painting and says, "Oh, I see someone of color. I see a black person. I see an African American. I see an Indian. I see a Pakistani," then maybe they feel that that's a boundary that they can't enter, right? Or if I paint a picture and it has someone of European descent, maybe a person of color can't enter into that conversation. But if there's no skin, then where does it leave the viewer? And so sometimes that standpoint can be a place of comfort, and sometimes that standpoint can be a place of confrontation. But I feel that what you're left with is the primal essential nature, which is to think and to feel. What do you feel when you hear jazz music, when there's no words? What do you feel when you walk in the grass? What do you feel when you feel the sunlight? There's no race in that. It's just about feeling it, right? And so that's the kind of experience that I'm trying to create when I'm painting a painting and removing the representation. It's so that the person who's transgender can have an equal experience with the person who's heterosexual, right? They're at equal footing. The hierarchies are flattened.
It's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment when you talk about this kind of universal act of feeling. You know, that I've always been drawn to art and to art exhibition making with this idea that you are physically in front of a work that allows you to feel or encourages you to experience your own feelings in another way, to add complexity to something that you've maybe struggled to put a finger upon, you know, when you encounter an artwork and it opens up that world for you. I mean, it's really a beautiful expression that you're sharing with us. And at the same time, I hesitate to sense that there is this universal experience of even feelings you brought up, nature, within our American experience, where certain groups have been excluded from nature. At the same time, other groups have had the abuse or a kind of uncaring sense of our own environment has been visited upon certain groups. So I don't think it's an equal experience, even as something that may seem as idyllic as an experience of nature. But I'm not posing that as to say unhelpful, but I'm saying there are limitations in how people experience that, or even, you know, have within our social contract a way to experience that. But when I look at your work, and I can enter into it. It's like a universe unto itself that I just thank you for producing and sharing with us. But I love how you're speaking about this art in spite of need, of basic needs, that art can sustain us, and there's something inspiring and hopeful about the act of art making, which kind of places it within the context of service. This is something we were talking about during this crisis, is a heightened sense that people who have the freedom to connect are speaking of how can I be of service? What can I do? What may I do? And what role does art play in that? It is a power moment for art and all of the protest art that we see through the protests and on the new fence around the White House. So in this sense, it's of service. So how do you feel in your own practice, which can be quite solitary, feel that you yourself are having these, do you wish that there was a reimaginative enactment of the WPA? Are you having conversations with your neighbors and in your building about your work? I love that people are on Zoom painting and creating work, right? How do everyone's grappling with this in different ways? What's it like in your neighborhood?
Yeah, so again, I'm thinking about this idea of pan and going from the all and global to the individual, and then what can one do within their own community. And so the idea of community is a varied thing. It could be close-knit friends, it could be family, it could be the people in your neighborhood. And so how do you kind of address your own needs and also in balance address the needs of others? And so for me, abstraction is that analog for hope, but there are many different analogs, right? And so whatever I think a person does best is what they should contribute to their own local kind of ring of friends, family, and community. So if you're good at cooking, maybe you cook and provide food for your neighbors. Something just as simple and as kind as that. Or it could just be wearing your mask, right? It could be wearing your gloves. And so you're not only doing it for yourself, you're doing it for the people around you. And so it's this level of compassion and also a level of sensitivity that I think that we're all in this together. And this totally transcends this us them, right? Because it's pan is all, it's everyone's included. Someone knows someone who's suffering, right? And so your community has been broadened, but it also can be as big or as small as you want it to be. And so I've chosen to call the specific people in my own community. And that could be, they don't necessarily have to live in my neighborhood. They could be artists that live in a different state. I have friends that live in Athens still that I call and see how they're doing. How are you dealing with this? I have friends that live in New York. I have family that lives in Louisiana. So the concept of connection, and I often would question this idea, of the iPad and the iPhone and all this meaning, what I interpret as the individual, right? And so are we really connected to the technology, or are we connecting to people? And so for the first time, I feel like I know that I'm using this technology to connect with people. I've gone days without checking my email, right? But every day I call someone, right? And I'm not texting them because I genuinely want to see how they're doing. And so, if there's a boundary with physical touch, technology is best used in the support of human need. And so, hey, call someone, use your phone. But whatever your gift is, for me, the gift is making art. At some point, this work will be seen, right? When the museum opens, the work I'm doing in the studio. And so then it shall have an effect on the viewer, because minds and feelings will still be expressed.
I love how you have expanded the idea of neighborhood, from this kind of physical environs to your neighborhood. The people in your neighborhood are all over the globe.
Right.
And there have been global aspects of this pandemic and the virus and the pandemic of racism. There have been global images. So I think I want to end because we can't talk forever, but we can continue. We'll consider an interrupted conversation, but I would love to end on the world at this moment through the eyes of Cullen Washington. What are you paying attention to? You say sometimes you don't do your email. What are you looking at? This is like the politics of regard. Or are you consuming imagery on TV? Are you consuming your catalogs? Are you just focused on the canvas? Are you looking at your neighbors through mask, eye to eye? What are you paying attention to right now?
I'm paying attention to hope. And for me, it's about rising above things that separate us. And I think, for me, Black is American. Black is human. White is American. We're all, we're human beings. And from a nationality standpoint, we're all Americans. And so the things that separate us retard our way to evolution, because we're here to evolve. And so for me, the hope is to create a possibility where a person can look at another person and say they are human like me.
Well, those are beautiful kind of empirical and huge concepts to deal with. But I think that anyone who sees Cullen's work, you do see universes opening up before you. So I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank you for the extraordinary exhibition up at UMMA right now. And I hope that we'll continue the conversation soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vera.